In the world of death, she thought she was alone, but the human proved she wasn't. The sun was a merciless tyrant over the desert, burning everything beneath it until even memories seemed ready to turn to ash. The sand here wasn't golden. It was a sea of gray dust and rust-red grit, littered with the skeletal remains of machines and men. Twisted steel towers jutted out of the horizon like broken bones, grim reminders that this wasn't a place for hope. This was an open grave. Through this scorched wasteland walked Lysara. Her bare feet sank slightly into the burning sand, yet she didn't flinch. Her purple skin shimmered under the cruel light, shifting in hue as though alive. Her long hair, the same deep violet as her skin, was tied back into a high braid, though stray strands whipped across her face in the dry wind. She carried a spear slung across her shoulder, forged from a metal no surviving army on this planet could name. Its surface bore the scars of many battles, deep gashes, char marks, and strange circular burns where plasma had struck and failed to kill her. To Lysara, the silence was the enemy now. Once there had been a war here so loud it drowned thought. The rattle of automatic rifles, the shriek of alien cannons, the deep, earth-shaking booms of orbital bombardments. But all of that was gone. The desert had claimed it all, leaving only her. At least, that's what she believed. Her people were gone. The humans she had fought against were gone. The sky was empty save for the heat shimmer. For 312 days, she had wandered from ruin to ruin, scavenging water from wrecked vehicles, cutting meat from carrion beasts that prowled the battlefield at night. No stars came to rescue her. No enemy came to finish her. Only the slow crawl of days, each one heavier than the last. It was on the 313th day that she saw the impossible. At first, it was just a distortion in the distance, a shape in the shimmering heat haze, moving slowly, deliberately. She narrowed her eyes, adjusting her stance. Her heart thudded once hard. Shapes in the desert were often mirages. She had learned to ignore them, but this one didn't vanish. Step by step, the figure became clearer. Humanoid, broad shoulders, sun-scorched skin. Pieces of desert camouflage armor clung to his frame, cracked and blackened from fire. In his hands, he carried something long, a rifle, though it looked half dead, its barrel warped by heat. A human. Lysara froze, her fingers tightening around her spear. The last time she had seen a human alive was the day her unit had slaughtered them in this very desert. She could still hear their screams when the sand turned red. She had thought that day had ended the war. She had thought it had ended them. Yet here one was, walking toward her through the ruins of a battlefield that belonged to neither of them anymore. The wind rose, carrying with it the faint jingle of metal, the sound of dog tags around his neck. He didn't run. He didn't raise his weapon. He just kept walking, his gaze locked on her as though he, too, couldn't believe what he was seeing. The desert between them felt like a living thing, holding its breath. Lysara's pulse quickened. Her mind split in two, part of her calculating how quickly she could close the gap and kill him if needed, the other part silently asking why she felt something else entirely. Not fear, not hatred, recognition. The heat between them was not just from the sun. Lysara kept her stance low, her spear angled, the point shimmering faintly in the light. Every instinct from a lifetime of war told her to strike first. In the desert, hesitation was death. But the human, he didn't flinch. He stopped only when there were about 20 paces between them. Sweat traced a crooked line down his dirt-streaked cheek. His lips were dry, cracked from days without water, yet he managed to speak. "You're real," he rasped, his voice hoarse from the heat. It was English, the language of her enemies, but Lysara understood enough from years of hearing it shouted across battlefields. His words sank into her like stones into water. She tilted her head, her braids swaying slightly. "So are you," she replied, her voice rough from disuse. For a moment, neither moved. A gust of hot wind swept between them, pulling with it the smell of scorched metal and the faint stench of death that never left this place. Then she noticed his leg. The human's left thigh was wrapped in strips of torn fabric, dark with dried blood. His steps had been steady, but now, standing still, she could see the slight tremor in his knee. He was hurt, badly. She could finish him now. One thrust of her spear, and he'd collapse into the dust, another corpse claimed by the war. But she didn't. Name, she demanded. He hesitated, not from fear, but calculation. Mason, he said finally. Staff Sergeant David Mason, U.S. Army. His voice carried weight when he spoke the last two words, as if the title still meant something, even here in this wasteland. And you. Lysara's grip on her spear tightened. Her name was not something she gave lightly. In her culture, it carried power, binding trust between warriors. But there was no army left to protect her secrets. Lysara, she said at last. Mason's gaze flicked over her, not just to her weapon and armor, but to her skin, her hair, the colors alien to this world. She could see the moment the recognition set in. You're, he swallowed. You're one of them. She didn't bristle. The label had lost its sting months ago. I was, she said simply. His jaw tightened. Your kind killed my unit, and yours killed mine. Silence stretched between them, heavy and brittle. Around them, the desert hummed with the faint hiss of wind sliding over dunes. Finally, Mason lowered his rifle. It wasn't surrender. She could see in his eyes that he was just as ready to kill her if she made a move. But it was something. I'm looking for water, he said. Lysara laughed once, a short, sharp sound. So is everyone who's still breathing. I know a place, Mason continued. An old supply depot. I passed it days ago, but it was swarming with scavenger drones. Couldn't get close alone. She studied him, her mind ticking through possibilities. This could be a trap, a way to lure her in close, only for him to put a bullet through her. But another thought crept in, uninvited. If he knows where there's water, it could mean survival. Why tell me? She asked. He shrugged slightly, wincing at the movement. Because I'm out of ammo, and you have a spear. We can either die apart, or maybe live long enough to hate each other a little longer. She almost smiled at that, almost. The desert sky darkened slightly as a cloud of dust rose in the distance. Lysara's attention snapped to it instantly. She knew that movement. Drones, she said sharply. Mason turned, spotting the faint glint of metal within the swirling grit. Small, spider-like machines skittered across the sand, their limbs stabbing into the ground with inhuman precision. They were hunting. Without thinking, Lysara closed the distance between them, grabbing Mason's arm and pulling him toward the nearest wrecked transport vehicle. The metal shell was half buried in sand, but it would serve as cover. What are you? Shut up, she hissed. The first drone crested the dune, its optical sensors swiveling. Its chassis was painted in faded desert camouflage, though the cracked paint revealed alien alloys beneath. Weapons scavenged from both sides of the war, fused into something efficient and merciless. Lysara waited until it was within 20 feet. Then she moved. Her spear flashed once in the sun before it pierced straight through the drone's sensor core. Sparks erupted, and the machine collapsed, twitching in the sand. Two more emerged over the ridge. Mason raised his rifle, aiming despite his limp. The first shot missed, kicking up sand. The second hit home, shattering a drone's leg. It screeched, a high-pitched metallic whine, before collapsing in a heap. The last one rushed forward, leaping with terrifying speed. Lysara caught it mid-air, slamming her spear down through its frame, pinning it to the ground. The machine's limbs flailed violently before going still. The silence returned, heavy as before. Mason looked at her, breathing hard. Guess I owe you one. Lysara retrieved her spear from the wreckage. You owe me water, she said flatly. He gave a short nod. Then let's move before more of those things find us. For the first time since the war had ended, Lysara walked beside a human without trying to kill him. The desert stretched ahead, and though it was still a graveyard, a strange, uneasy thought crept into her mind. She wasn't alone anymore. The desert swallowed sound as they moved. Only the crunch of boots and the soft hiss of Lysara's bare feet against the sand marked their passage. The sun had begun its slow descent, turning the dunes into jagged shadows that stretched across the battlefield like claws. Mason's limp was getting worse. Lysara noticed the way he shifted his weight, trying not to favor the injured leg, but failing. His breath came harder with every step. You'll slow us down, she said bluntly. You'll survive better with someone watching your back. Mason countered, his tone dry. Lysara's eyes narrowed. Unless you're the one who kills me first. That thought's crossed my mind, he admitted without hesitation. But the drones will probably get us both before I decide on that. She didn't respond. Not because she had no answer, but because the truth was gnawing at her. She was calculating the odds of survival, and with him, those odds were better than alone. The dunes shifted beneath their feet as they descended into a narrow basin. Here, the wreckage was thicker: crumpled aircraft, shattered armored transports, skeletal remains of tents fluttering in the dry wind. Lysara recognized the burn marks on the nearest vehicle, a plasma strike. She had fired similar shots herself. The realization settled uncomfortably in her stomach. Somewhere, in this very place, she may have helped erase lives like Mason's. They found shelter under the fractured wing of a downed fighter jet. Mason dropped his pack and sat heavily against the metal, hissing in pain as his leg protested. Lysara crouched nearby, resting her spear across her knees. "Let me see the wound." He gave her a long, guarded look. "And why would I do that?" "Because infection kills faster than bullets," she said, her voice flat but certain. Mason hesitated, then peeled back the makeshift bandages. Lysara studied the injury, a deep, ragged gash surrounded by angry red flesh. The edges were burned, likely from shrapnel heated on impact. "You've been walking on this for days," she said. "Welcome to war," Mason muttered. Lysara reached into a small pouch at her hip and pulled out a thin, black cloth. When she unwrapped it, Mason's eyes widened at the contents. A small vial of shimmering purple liquid. "What is that?" "Medicine. From my people." His jaw tensed. "And it works on humans." She didn't answer immediately. "It will either heal you, or it won't." "That's not very reassuring." "You don't have other options," she said simply. Mason exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Do it." Lysara poured a few drops into the wound. The liquid sizzled on contact, releasing a faint, sweet scent that didn't belong in a place like this. Mason gritted his teeth, but didn't cry out. Within seconds, the red edges of the wound began to darken, then fade to a healthier tone. He blinked, looking at her in disbelief. "Feels better." She shrugged. "You can thank me when we find water." The air changed then, not the wind, but the sound. A faint, low rumble, growing steadily. Lysara stiffened. She knew that sound. Hovercraft. Mason's expression hardened instantly. "How many?" She closed her eyes, listening. 3, maybe 4, coming from the west. They scrambled into motion. Mason slung his rifle, and Lysara gripped her spear. Together, they darted from wreck to wreck, keeping low. In the distance, the hovercraft crested the dune, sleek, dark shapes, their engines kicking up spirals of sand. Lysara recognized the insignia painted on the hulls. Scavenger clans. They weren't drones, but they were almost worse. Bands of survivors who looted the dead and killed the living for sport. Mason swore under his breath. "They'll have seen us by now." As if in answer, one of the hovercraft opened fire. Rounds tore through the sand around them, kicking up clouds of dust. "Run!" Lysara snapped. They sprinted across the basin, weaving between chunks of wreckage. Mason's limp slowed him, but adrenaline kept him moving. Lysara stayed just ahead, using the terrain to shield them from the incoming fire. They reached a half-buried bunker entrance, a jagged hole in the sand, its metal door torn from its hinges long ago. Without hesitation, Lysara dove inside, Mason following a second later. The interior was dim, the air thick with the smell of rust and old oil. Shafts of light pierced through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating broken crates and discarded weapons. They pressed themselves against the wall as the sound of engines roared past above. Lysara held her breath, straining to hear if the scavengers would stop. Minutes passed. The noise faded. Mason exhaled slowly. "We got lucky." Lysara shook her head. "Luck runs out fast in the desert." They explored deeper into the bunker. Most of the supplies were gone, but in one corner, Lysara found a small canteen, half filled. She tossed it to Mason. He caught it, hesitated, then offered it back. "Split it." Her eyebrows rose. "Generous." "Practical," he corrected. "If you die of thirst, I'm screwed." She took a small sip, then handed it back. The water was warm and metallic, but it eased the dry ache in her throat. When they sat again, the silence between them felt different. Less like a standoff, more like a pause between storms. "You ever regret it?" Mason asked suddenly. She glanced at him. Regret what? The war. The things you did. Lysara looked down at her spear. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, regret doesn't change the dead. It only slows the living. Mason studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Outside, the wind shifted again. Somewhere in the distance, a lone drone cried out in its metallic voice, searching for survivors. Lysara tightened her grip on her spear. The night was coming fast, and with it, the real danger. Night in the desert wasn't quiet. It was alive with whispers, the shifting of sand, the clicking of unseen creatures, and the low hum of machines searching for what they hadn't yet claimed. Lysara and Mason had barricaded themselves inside the ruined bunker, blocking the entrance with scrap metal. The air inside was still hot from the day, but it was better than the open night where scavenger eyes could spot them. Mason sat with his back against the wall, his rifle across his lap, listening to the faint wind whistling through the cracks in the ceiling. Lysara crouched by the far corner, sharpening her spear with deliberate, slow strokes. "How far to the supply depot?" she asked. Mason glanced up. 2 days if we're lucky. 3 if those hovercraft catch our trail. Her eyes narrowed. They will. He gave a humorless smile. I know. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the rasp of stone against metal. Lysara kept her eyes on her weapon, but her mind was elsewhere. She hated the thought that she needed him. She hated even more the small, flickering warmth she felt when she caught him watching her, not with hatred, but with something else. It was in the middle of that thought that the ground trembled. Both of them froze. A faint, rhythmic thump came from outside, heavy, deliberate, mechanical. Lysara rose slowly, her body tense, every sense straining. She had heard that sound before. Mason, she said quietly, do you have anything bigger than that rifle? He stood, shouldering the weapon. No. What? The answer came a heartbeat later as a shadow passed over the cracked ceiling above them. Massive, slow-moving, with a faint whir of servos. Walker unit. The enemy had deployed them in the last year of the war. Towering, 6-legged war machines, capable of erasing entire platoons in seconds. Most had been destroyed or abandoned after the ceasefire, but scavenger clans had been known to salvage and rewire them into hunting machines. This one was close. Too close. The first beam lanced down through the ceiling, scorching the wall inches from Mason's head. The smell of burnt metal filled the bunker. Moo! Lysara barked. They dove for the far side of the room as another blast tore through the roof, sending fragments raining down. The barricade at the entrance rattled violently, then ripped apart as the walker's claw-like manipulator tore the metal aside. The machine's optical sensor swept over them, glowing a bright, menacing red. Lysara didn't think. She hurled her spear with all the force she had. It struck the walker's sensor dead center. Sparks erupted, and the machine staggered, letting out a sound that was almost a roar. Mason was already moving, scrambling up the rubble toward the roof breach. He reached for her hand. Come on. She didn't hesitate. They climbed into the open night as the walker tried to reorient itself. The desert stretched in every direction, moonlight gleaming off the dunes. Behind them, the bunker shuddered as the walker began tearing it apart to reach them. Which way? She demanded. Mason pointed to the east. Ridge line. If we get over it, the dunes will hide us. They ran. Sand sprayed under their feet as the walker's heavy steps followed, shaking the ground with each impact. Mason fired over his shoulder, but the rounds pinged harmlessly off the machine's armored legs. Faster. Lysara snapped. I'm trying. The ridge loomed ahead, steep and treacherous. They scrambled upward, the sand giving way beneath their hands and feet. Behind them, the walker's claws slashed through the ground, gouging deep trenches. Lysara reached the top first and turned, grabbing Mason's arm and hauling him the last few feet. The walker reached the base of the ridge and stopped. Its legs shifted, the joints hissing. Then its upper body rotated, and the weapon mount locked onto them. Lysara knew what was coming. She shoved Mason hard. Down! The beam cut through the crest of the ridge, vaporizing sand and rock in a blinding flash. The heat seared her skin, and for a moment, she thought she'd lost her hearing entirely. When the light faded, the walker was gone. Or rather, half gone. Its upper frame lay in the sand below, twisted and burning. A distant, low thump echoed across the desert, an explosion from somewhere far off. Someone else had fired on it. Lasara and Mason stayed still for several long seconds, listening. But no one came. No footsteps, no engines. Whoever had taken that shot was already gone. Mason finally let out a breath. Guess we're not the only ones still alive out here. Lasara's gaze lingered on the burning wreck. No, she said, and that's not always good news. They descended the other side of the ridge in silence, their nerves raw from the close call. Every shadow felt heavier now, every sound sharper. That night, they camped in the shelter of a dune. Lasara sat with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the horizon. Mason lay nearby, his head resting on his pack, his eyes half closed. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You saved mine first," she replied. He gave a faint smile. "That's not how I remember it." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then Mason spoke again. "When this is over, if we make it to that depot, what happens after?" Lasara didn't look at him. "In the desert, there is no after. There's only the next day you survive. If you've ever rooted for an impossible love, you'll want to stay with them, because what comes next will push them to the edge." Subscribe for more stories like this, and don't miss the next part. The morning came without mercy. The desert sun climbed fast, burning away the cold of the night and replacing it with a heat that clung to the skin like a living thing. Mason woke first. His leg ached, but the strange purple medicine Lasara had used was holding. The infection was gone, and the wound, though still tender, no longer throbbed with every heartbeat. He shifted carefully, watching Lasara as she slept a few feet away, her head resting against the curve of the dune. Even at rest, her grip on her spear was tight. When she stirred, her eyes opened instantly, sharp and alert. No drowsy half-state, no vulnerability. Mason had the sudden realization that she might never truly sleep the way he did, that she lived in a constant state of readiness. "You were watching me," she said flatly. He didn't deny it. "After last night, I think it's smart to keep an eye out." Her expression didn't change. "You mean to keep an eye on me?" "Maybe both," he admitted. She rose, brushing the sand from her skin. "We need to move. The scavenger clans will investigate the Walker wreck. They'll know someone brought it down. And you think they'll connect that to us?" "I know they will." They broke camp quickly, not that there was much to break. The desert offered no comfort, only a constant demand to keep moving. By midday, the heat was a wall pressing down on them, and Mason was feeling it more than she was. They followed a shallow canyon, its sandstone walls offering brief moments of shade. Lasara walked in front, her movements efficient, conserving energy. Mason noticed that she scanned constantly, not just ahead but up, down, and behind them. After several hours, she stopped abruptly and raised a hand. Mason halted. "What is it?" he whispered. She didn't answer at first, just knelt and pressed her fingers into the sand. When she stood, her face was grim. "Tracks. Not scavengers. Not drones." Mason frowned. "Then who?" Before he could finish, a shadow passed overhead. They both looked up. A small craft swept low over the canyon, its hull black and unmarked. Mason's heart jumped into his throat. It wasn't human. He could tell from the way the engines hummed with a high, almost musical frequency. Lasara's jaw tightened. "My people." Mason instinctively brought his rifle up. "I thought you said they were gone." "They were. Or I thought they were." She turned to face him fully. "If that's a patrol ship, we can't let them see us together. They'll kill you on sight. And what about you?" Her expression was unreadable. "If they believe I abandoned them, they'll kill me too." The ship banked in the distance, circling lazily like a hawk that had spotted prey. "Move," Lasara ordered. They sprinted deeper into the canyon, following its winding path until the sound of the craft faded. Mason's chest burned from the run, but he didn't stop until she did. When they finally rested, she kept looking back toward the sky. "If my people are here, it changes everything. The depot might not be safe anymore." Mason leaned against the canyon wall, panting. "Then where the hell do we go?" She didn't answer. They pressed on until the canyon widened into a flat expanse dotted with the skeletal remains of old comms towers. The metal frames creaked in the wind, their rusted edges catching the sun. It fell exposed here, too open. Halfway across, Mason's boot struck something hard buried in the sand. He crouched and brushed it away, a piece of metal plating with a faded emblem of the U.S. Army. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked at Lasara. This was one of our relay stations. If there's a cache nearby. Before he could finish, the ground shuddered beneath them. Not like the walker. This was softer, slower. A vibration that built steadily until the sand just ahead of them erupted. Something burst from the ground. A creature of sand and bone, its body armored in jagged chitin, eyes glowing a sickly yellow. It stood twice Mason's height, its many legs skittering with unnatural speed. Lasara didn't hesitate. She hurled her spear, but the creature twisted, the weapon glancing off its armored shell. Mason fired, the bullets punching small holes but failing to slow it. The thing lunged. Mason dove aside, feeling the rush of air as one of its clawed limbs smashed into the ground where he'd stood. Lasara darted in, retrieving her spear in one smooth motion, and drove it into one of the creature's eyes. It screeched, a sound so loud Mason's ears rang. It thrashed violently, hurling Lasara backward. Mason scrambled to his feet, aiming for the wounded eye. He fired 3 shots in quick succession, each one finding the soft, exposed tissue. The creature convulsed, then collapsed in a heap, its legs curling inward. The silence afterward was deafening. Mason lowered his rifle slowly. What the hell was that? Lasara wiped blood, both hers and the creature's, from her skin. A desert stalker. They hunt anything that moves at night, but this one's hunting early, which means something has disturbed the balance here. She glanced at the dead creature, then at him. We need to move faster. Whatever brought my people back, it's already changing the desert. They didn't stop until the sun was dipping low again. They found shelter in the remains of a collapsed radio station. The roof caved in, but the walls still standing. That night, Mason found himself staring at the alien across the small fire they'd built. She was cleaning her spear, her movements slow, precise. You said your people would kill you if they found you, he said quietly. Why? Lasara didn't look up. Because I stayed. After the war ended, I could have left. I could have gone back to my world. But I didn't. Why not? She paused, then met his gaze. Because I thought there might be something worth saving here. The fire crackled between them. Mason wanted to ask if she still believed that, but he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant hum of engines. The night dragged on in uneasy silence. Mason had taken first watch, sitting with his back to the cracked wall of the ruined radio station. The desert stretched out before him, black under the moonlight, shifting subtly with the wind. He kept his rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale movement of scavenger patrols or drones. Lasara slept lightly, her spear never more than an arm's reach away. Even in rest, her breathing was steady, controlled, a soldier's discipline. Mason caught himself watching her, wondering how many nights she'd survived like this, alone, before he came along. When her eyes opened, it was as though she'd never been asleep. Your watch is over, she said. Mason hesitated. You sure? I don't mind. I'm sure, she said, already standing. He shifted, laying down on the hard ground. Wake me if anything moves. Anything always moves, she replied, turning toward the open desert. By dawn, they were moving again. The radio station lay far behind them, just another forgotten ruin in a world full of them. The air was cooler in the morning, and Mason found himself keeping up better, his leg no longer a constant source of pain thanks to her strange medicine. They passed through a graveyard of war machines, tanks half buried in dunes, aircraft stripped to their skeletons, twisted piles of metal that had once been weapons capable of leveling cities. Mason slowed, looking over the devastation. This used to mean something, he said quietly, gesturing to the wreckage. All of it. We thought we were defending the world. You probably thought you were conquering it. Lasara didn't slow. We weren't so different. Both sides were told they were right. He frowned. And now? Now we walk through the bones of our reasons, she said, her tone even. They moved in silence after that, until they reached a jagged ridge of black rock. The climb was steep, and Mason's boots slipped on the loose gravel more than once. Lasara, barefoot, scaled it with fluid ease. She reached the top first and extended a hand down to him. He hesitated, not because he didn't trust her grip, but because the gesture itself felt strange. Then he took it. Her hand was warm, her grip strong enough to pull him up without effort. At the summit, the desert opened into a flat plain, the horizon broken by the faint silhouette of structures. Mason narrowed his eyes. At the depot, Lasara studied it. Could be. Or it could be a trap. Comforting, he muttered. They reached the outskirts by late afternoon. The buildings were low, square, their walls made of reinforced concrete, sun-bleached and cracked. The gates hung open, one of them twisted from an old explosion. Inside, the silence was heavier than the desert's. Rows of crates stood stacked along the walls, many of them broken open, their contents long gone. Mason approached one of the intact crates, prying it open with his rifle barrel. Inside were sealed metal canisters marked with faded labels. He grinned faintly. Water filtration units. If they still work, we're in luck. Lasara wasn't smiling. She was scanning the shadows, her posture tense. What? Mason asked. Too quiet, she said. The first shot echoed through the depot before he could answer. Mason dove behind a crate as the round sparked against the concrete near his head. Lasara rolled into cover beside him, her spear already in her hands. 3 figures emerged from the far side of the depot. Humans, dressed in ragged scavenger armor, their weapons crude but functional. The leader, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, called out, "Drop the weapons and we'll let you live." Mason glanced at Lasara. "I'm guessing that's a lie." "It's a bad one," she said. The scavengers spread out, trying to flank. Mason leaned out and fired 2 shots, forcing them back into cover. Lasara, moving with sudden speed, dashed along the side of the nearest building, disappearing from his sight. The leader barked an order, and one of the scavengers moved to follow. But a moment later, he cried out as Lasara's spear drove through his shoulder. She yanked it free and swept his legs, dropping him hard onto the concrete. Mason took the opening, shooting the second scavenger in the leg. The man screamed, dropping his weapon. The leader, realizing he was alone, backed toward the gate. Lasara stepped into his path. "Leave now," she said, her voice like steel, "and you keep your life." He spat her feet, but he went. When it was over, Mason lowered his rifle and exhaled. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Lasara wiped her spear clean on a scrap of cloth. "You already are. You're human." For a second, he thought she was serious, until he caught the faint curl of her lips. They worked together to secure the depot. Mason tested one of the filtration units and found it functional. They filled their canteens, the first real water they'd had in days. Mason drank deeply, then passed the canteen to her without hesitation. She took it, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before she drank. That night, they didn't set up watch in shifts. They both stayed awake, sitting side by side against the crate, weapons in easy reach. Outside, the wind whispered over the sand, but inside, the silence was almost comfortable. Mason glanced at her. "Why did you save me that first day? You could have left me to die." Lasara's eyes stayed on the darkness beyond the gate. "Because you kept walking toward me when you saw what I was." No human had ever done that before. He didn't answer right away. The firelight caught the faint shimmer in her skin, the strands of her violet hair shifting in the breeze. "Maybe I thought you were just a mirage," he said finally. Her gaze flicked to him then, and for the briefest moment, there was no war in her eyes. Only something unspoken, fragile, and dangerous. The dawn came blood-red. From the roof of the depot, Mason could see the horizon rippling with heat and movement. Dust plumes, many of them, rising like the smoke of a slow-burning fire. Lasara joined him silently, her eyes narrowing. "Scavenger army?" Mason asked. "No," she said, voice tight. "Warborn." He felt a cold weight drop into his gut. The Warborn weren't just scavengers. They were ex-soldiers from both sides of the war, men and women broken by loss, forged into a tribe that killed everything that crossed their path. "How many?" he asked. "Too many." By midday, the sound of engines and boots carried over the sand. Mason and Lasara had fortified the depot as best they could. Barricades at the entrances, tripwires along the walls, ammo counted and ready. But it wasn't enough. The Warborn arrived like a storm. Armored vehicles bristling with makeshift turrets rolled into view. Figures dismounted, dozens of them, their weapons mismatched but deadly. Mason and Lasara exchanged a look. No words, just understanding. The first wave came hard and fast, gunfire hammering the concrete, ricochets sparking off walls. Mason dropped 3 before the rest scattered into cover. Lasara moved like a shadow, her spear a blur as she lunged from the barricades, striking and vanishing before they could hit her. An RPG slammed into the upper floor, blowing part of the wall into rubble. Mason hit the ground hard, dust choking his lungs. He looked up to see Lasara dragging him out of the collapsing room, her grip iron. They hit the lower floor just as the Warborn breached the gate. Mason switched to close-quarters fire, each shot echoing in the tight space. Lasara met them head-on, her spear finding gaps in their armor. But there were too many. "Mason!" she shouted, tossing him a spare mag. He caught it, reloaded, and kept firing. The bodies piled, but the Warborn kept coming. One of them, a giant with a jagged metal mask, swung a steel pipe at Lasara. She blocked with the shaft of her spear, but the impact sent her stumbling. Mason shot the man twice, dropping him, but another came from behind. He didn't think, just moved. Mason tackled the Warborn, the 2 of them crashing through a stack of crates. The man's knife flashed in the dust, cutting across Mason's arm. He gritted his teeth, headbutt him, and ripped the knife away, driving it home. When he looked up, Lasara was bleeding, a deep gash across her side, dark violet blood soaking into her torn armor. "Still alive," she said through clenched teeth. Mason pulled her into cover. "You can't." "I can." She cut him off. She rose, her spear dripping, and went back into the fight. The next few minutes were chaos. Explosions rattled the depot. Mason's ears rang, his vision narrowing to flashes of movement and bursts of muzzle fire. Lasara was everywhere, striking, dodging, weaving through the storm. Then Mason saw the Warborn leader. Tall, armored in scavenged plating, carrying a rotary cannon he could barely believe still worked. The man swept it across the courtyard, cutting down his own as well as theirs. Mason knew instantly. Kill him, or they were done. "Lasara," he yelled, pointing. She saw him too. They moved together, Mason laying down fire to keep the leader's attention, Lasara circling wide through the shadows. The rotary cannon roared, chewing chunks out of walls. Mason dove behind cover, rounds sparking inches from his head. Lasara struck from behind, her spear driving deep into the leader's armor. But he turned, bellowing, smashing the spear's shaft in half with a backhand blow. She went down hard. Mason was moving before he realized it. He vaulted the barricade, charging straight into the fire. The rotary cannon swung toward him, but jammed with a mechanical shriek. The leader dropped it and drew a massive combat blade. Mason didn't slow. The first swing missed by inches. The second caught his vest, tearing fabric and skin. He slammed into the man, driving them both into the wall. The blade clattered away. The leader's hands went for Mason's throat. Mason grabbed the broken half of Lasara's spear from the ground and drove it up under the man's chin. The fight ended in a gurgle and a fall. Silence hit like a hammer. The Warborn, seeing their leader dead, began to scatter. Some fired a last shot over their shoulders, but most just ran into the desert. Mason staggered to Lasara's side. She was on one knee, breathing hard, blood still seeping from her wound. "You're insane," she said, but there was no anger in it. "Yeah," he panted, but it worked. They patched each other up in the ruined courtyard, surrounded by bodies and smoke. Mason's arm throbbed, his vest hung in tatters, and Lasara's side would scar, but they were alive. As night fell, they sat against the wall together. The air still smelled of gunpowder and blood. Mason broke the silence. "You didn't have to fight for me like that," he said. Her eyes caught the firelight. "Neither did you." For a long moment, they didn't look away. Somewhere out in the dark, the wind carried the scent of rain, a rare thing in the desert. The world felt heavier after the Warborn were gone. Not because the fight hadn't been worth it, but because silence, after so much chaos, had a way of making the weight of survival settle deep in the bones. The depot smelled of smoke and iron. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some human, some alien, all stripped of their former sides. Mason and Lasara worked without speaking, dragging corpses outside, salvaging ammunition, piling weapons in the corner in case the warborn regrouped. When the last body hit the sand, Mason stood in the doorway for a moment, just breathing in the cool night air. The wind was stronger now, sweeping across the desert with a faint wetness to it. Rain. It had been months since he'd felt it. Lysara joined him, her side freshly bandaged but still stiff in her movements. She didn't lean on him, but he could see the fatigue behind her steady gaze. "You fought before," she said, not as a question. "Yeah," Mason replied. "Long before you ever saw this desert." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. They sat on the low wall outside, watching the stars emerge through the haze. The battlefield was just a black smear in the moonlight now, the machines and corpses reduced to shapes that no longer looked human or alien. "I used to think," Lysara said quietly, "that surviving a battle meant you'd won." Mason glanced at her. "And now I think it just means you get to live with it." They let the thought hang between them. By midnight, the first drops of rain began to fall, slow, deliberate, soaking into the dust. Mason tilted his head back, letting the water run down his face, cooling the heat still radiating from his skin. Lysara closed her eyes, her violet hair darkening as the rain slid through it. When the rain grew stronger, they retreated inside. The depot's roof leaked in a dozen places, but the sound of water dripping on the floor was oddly comforting. Mason lit a small fire in an old oil drum, and they sat across from each other, steam rising from their damp clothes. It was Lysara who finally spoke again. "Where will you go?" she asked. He poked at the fire with a metal rod. "Haven't thought that far ahead." "You." Her eyes flicked to the flames. "I was looking for my people. But they're not here. Not anymore." Mason knew what that felt like, the hollow realization that there was no one left to find. "You could stay here," he said. "For a while at least." Her expression didn't change, but there was something softer in her voice. "With you." He met her gaze. "Yeah, with me." Outside, the rain became a steady curtain, washing the battlefield clean, or as clean as it would ever get. The next morning, the desert was unrecognizable. The rain had turned the sand dark and firm, and the air carried a scent Mason had almost forgotten. Life. Small green shoots had already begun to push through the damp soil near the edges of the depot, stubborn and defiant. They walked the perimeter together, checking for signs of another attack. None came. The warborn were gone. For now. Mason stopped near the far wall and looked out over the endless sand. "I used to think this place was just a graveyard," he said. "But maybe it's not done yet." Lysara followed his gaze. "The desert doesn't choose sides. It kills, but also gives back." Slowly, her hand brushed against his as they stood there. Neither of them moved away. By evening, they decided to stay at the depot for at least a few weeks. It was defensible, stocked with enough supplies to keep them alive while they repair the damage from the fight. Mason rigged a water collection system on the roof, while Lysara cleaned and repaired her broken spear, using salvaged parts from warborn weapons. In the quiet moments, Mason caught himself watching her, the way the firelight played across her violet skin, the precise, almost ceremonial way she sharpened her weapons. She never spoke of her world, but he could see pieces of it in her movements, in the way she carried herself like someone still bound by a code older than this war. One night, as they sat near the fire, she said, "You saved me." He shook his head. "You saved me first." They didn't need to argue the point. The truth was that they had both stepped into death for each other, and that wasn't something either of them would forget. By the end of the week, the depot felt different. The holes in the walls were patched. The smell of rot was gone. The sound of the rain barrels filling was a reminder that life could still find its way here. Mason woke one morning to find Lysara already outside, standing in the early light. She was barefoot in the wet sand, her spear planted beside her, staring out at the horizon. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't turn, just listening. He joined her. The desert was quiet, but not empty. The sound of wind through the new chutes, the faint trickle of water somewhere underground. It felt alive in a way Mason hadn't heard in years. She finally looked at him, and for the first time since they'd met, her expression was almost a smile. Maybe they hadn't just survived the battle. Maybe they'd started something. The desert was no longer the same place Mason had walked into. It hadn't changed much to the eye, The dunes still shifted in slow waves, the wind still whispered in low, endless tones, but something beneath the surface felt different. He'd thought for so long that surviving was about endurance. Keep walking, keep breathing, keep eating just enough to see the next sunrise. But now, with Lasara beside him, he realized survival wasn't a straight line. It was something you built with someone else. It was the moments between danger when you dare to think about tomorrow. One evening, they climbed the crumbling watchtower at the edge of the depot. From up there, the desert stretched out like an ocean of silver under the moon. Mason leaned on the rusted rail, scanning the horizon. When I first got stuck out here, I thought I'd die in days. The heat, the emptiness, the warborn. I didn't think anyone could make it. Lasara's voice was quiet. I didn't think anyone should make it. Not here. My people, we called this place the Hollow Earth. A planet's corpse, still walking through space. Mason looked at her, catching the way the moonlight traced the lines of her face, the sharp planes and alien symmetry softened by the faintest human emotion. You still think that? She was silent for a moment. Then, no, not anymore. They stayed up there for hours, speaking in fragments, sometimes not at all. Mason told her about his home, a small town in Oregon, where the rain was constant and the forest smelled of cedar and earth. She told him about the seas of her world, black waters dotted with islands of glass that caught the sun like fire. Neither place seemed possible anymore, yet both lived in their words. And Mason realized something. They weren't just trading memories. They were planting them here, in this ruined place, as if willing the desert to remember them too. Days turned to weeks. The depot became less a fortress and more a home. The battlefield around it faded back into sand. They repaired what could be repaired, and they let the rest crumble into history. Sometimes Mason would catch Lasara sitting alone at the edge of the dunes, staring at nothing. He didn't interrupt. He knew she was speaking with ghosts, the same way he did when he thought of the friends he'd lost. One afternoon, he joined her there. The sun was high, but the wind was cool. "What do you think happens to us?" he asked. She tilted her head. "When we die." "Yeah." Her gaze stayed on the horizon. "I think we join the places we've been. The land remembers. The wind, the sand, the rain, they carry what we were. And if someone listens closely enough, they'll hear us again." Mason took a deep breath. "I hope they hear that we tried." That night, the rain came back. Heavy this time, pounding against the roof and spilling over the sides of the barrels. Mason and Lasara sat by the fire, watching the drops streak down the cracked windows. The air inside was warm, the smell of damp earth drifting in with the breeze. Mason found himself thinking about the future, something he'd stopped doing long ago. "Do you ever wonder," he said slowly, "if maybe we weren't meant to meet, but the desert didn't give us a choice?" Lasara's eyes flicked to him. "You think the desert cares about us?" He shrugged. "Maybe not. But it's strange, isn't it? Out of all the billions of people and places, we both ended up here. Alive." She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "Not strange. Necessary." The word stayed with him long after the fire died down. By morning, the desert was alive again. Water pooled in the low spots between dunes. Tracks of small animals dotted the wet sand. The air felt lighter, almost gentle. Mason stood outside, the sun warm on his back, and realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for the next fight. Lasara joined him, her footsteps silent in the damp earth. They stood side by side, watching the horizon. "You're not alone anymore," he said without looking at her. Her voice was steady. "Neither are you. If you've ever thought survival was just about staying alive, remember, sometimes survival is finding someone worth surviving with." Months passed. The desert had changed, not dramatically, but enough for Mason to notice. Patches of stubborn green clung to the ground where rain had pooled. The wind carried fewer whispers of death, more of life pushing through. The depot was no longer just a shelter. It was theirs. The walls bore new repairs, not from desperation, but from care. The rusted gates stood open now during the day, letting in the wind and the occasional wandering animal. Mason had built a lookout point from scavenged steel, high enough to see far across the dunes. It was where he stood most mornings, a mug of bitter coffee in hand, scanning for danger out of habit. He still saw the tracks of war sometimes, broken metal half buried in the sand, the scattered bones of machines and soldiers alike. but they were fading. Lysara had changed too. The stiffness in her movements was gone. The deep wariness in her eyes had softened. She still trained every day, her spear an extension of her arm, but there was no longer a constant tension in her shoulders. She'd learned to smile, even if only a little, and when she did, it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. One evening, they sat on the roof as the sun went down, their legs dangling over the edge. The desert glowed in layers of gold and deep red, shadows stretching like long fingers toward the horizon. "I used to think I'd leave as soon as I could," Lysara said quietly. Mason sipped his coffee. "What changed?" She gave a small shrug. "I realized I wasn't waiting to be rescued anymore." He didn't reply right away. The truth was, he'd stopped thinking about leaving too. The desert had become a part of him, and so had she. One night, a storm rolled in from the east, lightning flashing across the dunes, thunder so deep it shook the depot's foundations. Mason and Lysara stood in the doorway, watching sheets of rain blur the horizon. "Do you think they'll come back?" Mason asked, meaning the warborn. Lysara's answer was simple. "If they do, we'll be ready." And he knew she meant we. Not you. Not me. When spring came, if it could be called spring in a place like this, the desert surprised them. Small flowers bloomed in clusters, fragile but defiant, their colors striking against the sand. Mason found Lysara kneeling by one of the patches, her violet hair falling forward as she studied the petals. "Back home," she said softly, "flowers like these grew only after fire. My people call them memory blooms, proof that the land never truly forgets." Mason crouched beside her. "Then maybe this place remembers more than we think." She glanced at him, and for the first time, there was no trace of distance in her eyes. Just certainty. Years later, the desert would remember them too. The depot would stand, weathered but whole. Travelers would speak of a place guarded by two figures, one human, one alien, who had turned a battlefield into a refuge. Some would say they were lovers. Some would say they were soldiers who never stopped fighting. Others would insist they were ghosts, bound to the land they refused to abandon. The truth would be simpler. They were just two people who'd found each other in a place meant to kill them both, and refused to let go. Mason and Lysara stood at the edge of the dunes one last time that season, the horizon painted with the colors of another coming storm. "This place will never be easy," Mason said. Lysara's voice was steady. "Good. Easy things don't last." They turned back toward the depot, side by side, ready for whatever would come. If you've ever believed that survival is about more than just living, if you've ever hoped to find someone worth surviving for, share this story, leave your thoughts, and join us for more tales of impossible connections that refuse to die.